The coat wasn't even mine to be going through. It was Vanessa's good wool coat, the charcoal one she saved for client meetings, and I was only holding it because the dry cleaner had called about a stain she'd asked me to check before I dropped it off, and my hands went into the pockets out of nothing more than habit, the same habit that's kept me alive 14 years on a truck, checking every pocket, every seam, before you commit to anything. My name is Owen. I'm 41, and I've spent most of my adult life running toward burning buildings other people are running away from. I've pulled people out of situations that should have killed them. I know what it feels like to have 5 seconds to decide something that will matter for the rest of your life. What I did not know, standing in our bedroom on an ordinary Tuesday evening with my wife's coat in my hands, was that I already had that kind of decision sitting in my palm and didn't know it yet. The bracelet was thin, gold, the kind of delicate thing Vanessa never wore because she said fine jewelry didn't survive a life spent measuring fabric and hauling paint cans for clients. There was a small charm on it, a single letter V, and when I turned it over there was an inscription on the inside of the clasp, small enough that I had to tilt it toward the lamp to read it at all. To Vanessa, always. I didn't buy this. I know every piece of jewelry I have ever given my wife in 12 years of marriage, because I remember standing in the store each time, sweating slightly, trying to pick something that would make her face do the thing it does when she's genuinely happy instead of just being polite about a gift. This wasn't one of mine. I would have remembered buying this. I stood there for a long time, the coat still draped over my other arm, feeling something colder than I expected settle into my chest. Not yet grief. Not yet even suspicion, not fully, more like the particular stillness that comes right before an alarm sounds, that half second where some animal part of you already knows before the rest of you has caught up. Vanessa was downstairs making dinner. I could hear Sophie arguing with Noah about whose turn it was to set the table, the ordinary music of our house on an ordinary evening, and I stood upstairs holding proof of something I didn't have words for yet, turning a stranger's inscription over in my hand like it might mean something different the second time I read it. It didn't. To Vanessa, always. Someone had chosen those words carefully. Someone had stood in a jewelry store somewhere, the way I had stood in jewelry stores for 12 years, trying to say something true in 4 small words, and it wasn't me. I put the bracelet in my own coat pocket, I don't fully know why, except that some instinct told me I wasn't ready yet to confront what it meant, and I needed it somewhere I controlled instead of somewhere she might quietly retrieve it before I decided what to do. I hung her coat back exactly where it had been. I went downstairs and ate dinner with my family and said almost nothing, and Vanessa asked twice if I was feeling okay, and I said I was just tired from a bad call at the station, which wasn't even a lie, just not the truth either. I didn't sleep that night. And I had no idea yet that the bracelet wasn't the only thing hidden in our house that had someone else's handwriting on it. We'd met 13 years earlier at a mutual friend's wedding in Charlottesville, both of us seated at the same table of odd, unpaired guests, and she'd made a joke about the band being louder than any structure fire I'd ever actually attended, and I'd laughed harder than the joke probably deserved because something about her landed differently than most people did. She was warm in a way that drew rooms toward her, the kind of person who remembered everyone's kids' names, who noticed when someone at a party was standing alone and made it her business to fix that. I loved that about her from the beginning. I think some part of me had always understood, distantly, that a person who gave that much warmth to everyone might, on some quiet night I hadn't imagined yet, run short of it for the one person she'd promised it to permanently. We married a year later. Sophie came 4 years after that, Noah 4 years after her, and the 12 years since had the specific, unglamorous texture of a life built mostly out of logistics, my shifts at the station, her client meetings, school pickups traded back and forth like currency, the two of us mostly passing each other in doorways with a kiss and a list of things the other one needed to know before the day continued. I want to be fair to that life, because it was real, and for most of those years it was enough. I didn't understand, standing there with a stranger's bracelet in my pocket, how long it had actually stopped being enough for her, or how much of that I hadn't noticed because I'd been too busy assuming the doorway kisses meant everything underneath them was still fine. Vanessa came upstairs around 10 that night while I was pretending to read. She sat on the edge of the bed to take off her earrings, the same small nightly ritual she'd had for years, and I watched her reach automatically for the closet, for the coat, the way she did most nights before bed to hang it properly instead of leaving it thrown over a chair. My whole body went still. She didn't check the pockets. She never did. She hung it up and turned off the closet light and came to bed beside me, and I lay there afterward with the bracelet sitting 18 inches away in my own coat pocket, and I said nothing at all. I didn't know it yet, but that bracelet was going to turn out to be the smallest, most recent piece of something that had been quietly accumulating in our house for almost a year, hidden in places I would never have thought to look, if I hadn't, that Tuesday, gone looking for something else entirely. Owen and Vanessa built a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of marriage people say they want: steady, full, busy in the specific way that comes from 2 demanding careers and 2 young kids and very little time left over to examine anything too closely. We had a house in the Fan District with a porch swing. Vanessa had restored herself the summer before Noah was born. We had Sunday dinners with her parents, my shift schedule taped to the fridge in 3 different colors of marker so everyone in the house always knew whether I'd be home for dinner or asleep at the station. We joked, more than once, that we ran our marriage like a small, well-managed company, and for years I thought that was a compliment. Looking back now, I think the first thing I should have noticed happened almost a year before the bracelet, in a season I barely remember because nothing about it seemed remarkable at the time. Vanessa's business had grown that spring, a magazine feature, a wave of new clients, more hours than she'd worked in years, and she started taking meetings some evenings instead of just during the day, said the clients with the biggest budgets only had time after their own workdays ended. I remember being proud of her that spring, genuinely proud, and I think that pride made it easier not to ask many questions about a schedule that had quietly doubled without much explanation. The renovation project came next, a historic property downtown she'd been hired to redesign, a job she talked about constantly for months, always mentioning the contractor she was working with, a man named Ethan who apparently had opinions about original hardwood that Vanessa found either endlessly charming or endlessly irritating depending on the week. I heard his name so often that spring it stopped registering as a name at all. It became furniture, background noise, the way a coworker's name becomes wallpaper in someone else's stories about their day. I didn't ask why a contractor's opinions about hardwood came up at dinner more nights than my own captain's name did. Not because I hadn't noticed the frequency. Because some part of me had already decided that asking would mean admitting I'd started keeping score, and keeping score felt like an insult to a marriage I still believed was solid. There was a night in late summer, maybe 8 months before the bracelet, when Sophie asked at dinner, entirely without malice, the way kids ask things that adults have spent months carefully not asking directly, "Mom, is Ethan going to come to my birthday? You talk to him more than you talk to Dad." Vanessa laughed it off smoothly, said something about work friendships being different than family, that of course Ethan wasn't invited to a 9-year-old's birthday party, don't be silly. I remember thinking, even in the moment, that it was a strange thing for a child to have noticed at all, and an even stranger thing for an adult to have an answer for that fast, that light, like she'd already anticipated a version of this exact question long before Sophie ever asked it. I didn't think about it again for weeks. I should have. That was the first thread, and I let it go slack in my hands without even registering that I was holding it at all. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever heard your own child say something that lands wrong in a way you can't fully explain, a small offhand comment that sits in your chest longer than it should for something so innocent, you already know that particular unease doesn't announce itself clearly. It passes through you and you tell yourself it's nothing, because the alternative feels disproportionate to a 9-year-old's passing remark at a dinner table. That was the moment I should have followed. I let it go instead, because Noah knocked over his milk and the whole table dissolved into the small chaos of napkins and a 5-year-old's dramatic apology, and by the time I thought about Sophie's comment again, 3 weeks had already turned into 3 months. My work schedule that fall was brutal, a string of understaffed shifts, 2 bad calls back to back that left me sleeping poorly even on my days off, the particular exhaustion that comes from a job where you occasionally watch things you can't unsee. I told myself that was why I wasn't paying closer attention at home, that if I could just get through the worst of the schedule, I'd have the bandwidth to notice things the way I used to. It's a strange kind of logic, looking back. I could read a room full of smoke in under a minute and know exactly where the danger actually was versus where it only looked like it was. And somehow I couldn't apply that same instinct to my own kitchen table, where the actual danger had been sitting in plain sight for months, disguised as a conversation about hardwood floors. I told myself I was too tired to examine anything closely. I understand now that exhaustion is also a kind of cover, a legitimate reason not to look, that doesn't require admitting you're also afraid of what you'd see. Vanessa's mood that fall had a rhythm to it I only understood much later. She was lighter on the days after site visits to the renovation project, genuinely lighter, laughing easily, more patient with the kids, more affectionate with me in a way that felt, at the time, like a gift I hadn't done anything specific to earn. And then, a few days later, she'd go distracted and short-tempered, snapping at small things, my boots left by the door, the television too loud, a schedule mix-up with Noah's pickup. I used to think of it as stress from the demands of a growing business. It never once occurred to me that I was watching the rhythm of someone managing a second emotional life, and that the highs and lows didn't line up with anything actually happening in our house at all. One night in October, I came home from a 24-hour shift to find Vanessa sitting on the porch swing alone in the dark, well past midnight, her phone face down on the cushion beside her. I sat down next to her and asked what was wrong. "Nothing," she said, too quickly, and then, recovering, "just thinking about the Winchester project. Client stuff. It's fine." I remember noticing that she didn't lean into me the way she usually did when I sat down beside her after a long shift. She held herself slightly apart, the way you hold yourself apart from something you're afraid might notice too much if you get too close. Something tightened in my chest that night, low and unfamiliar, and I told myself it was just the exhaustion of the shift talking. I was getting good, by then, at explaining things away before I'd even fully felt them. The next real crack came from an unexpected place, my mother, of all people, who ran into Vanessa having coffee downtown one weekday afternoon with a man my mother didn't recognize, and mentioned it in passing weeks later, entirely without suspicion, the way you'd mention any small, unremarkable thing. She looked happy, my mother said. Good for her, getting a coffee break in the middle of all that renovation chaos. I asked Vanessa about it that night, casually, over dishes. She said it was Ethan, of course, discussing the project timeline, that coffee meetings were normal in the design business, that my mother must have caught them at an ordinary work moment and made more of it than it was. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the third time in 2 months that a reasonable explanation had arrived just a beat too fast, phrased just a little too smoothly, like she'd rehearsed the shape of it in advance for exactly this kind of question. I didn't push. I told myself it was because I trusted her, and I believe now that trust and simple exhaustion can look almost identical from the outside, and that I'd stopped having the energy to tell them apart. I want to be honest about my own part in what follows, because it would be too easy to tell this story as though I were simply an unlucky bystander to someone else's unraveling. I wasn't. I have always been a person who trusts almost automatically, sometimes to a fault, a habit built, I think, from growing up in a house where my parents' marriage was steady and unremarkable in the best possible way, where I never once had a reason to suspect the people I loved of hiding something from me. It made me generous in a lot of good ways over the years. It also made me slow to suspect anything, because suspicion had never once been rewarded in my own life before, and some part of me genuinely believed it never would be. It meant that for 12 years of marriage, whenever something small felt slightly off, my instinct was never to interrogate it. My instinct was to give Vanessa the benefit of every doubt, assume the best, trust that a woman I loved wouldn't build an entire second life 18 inches away from the one we'd built together. I called this faith in her. I understand now it was also, in its own way, a kind of willful blindness, dressed up as a virtue. I smiled through most of that fall, even on the night something in me wanted to ask a direct question and simply didn't. It was easier that way. Easier, at least, until it stopped being easier at all. There was one more sign that fall, smaller than the others, whose true size I only understood much later. Vanessa started keeping a small locked box in her home office, a place she'd never locked anything before in 12 years, receipts, she said, tax documents, client contracts she didn't want the kids getting into. It was a reasonable explanation for a woman running a growing business. It also meant that from that point forward, whatever else was accumulating in our house had a place to live that I had no reason, and no permission, to ever open. By early December, I had accumulated enough of these small, individually dismissible moments that some part of my brain had already built a shape out of them, even though I refused, consciously, to look directly at what that shape was. The porch swing at midnight. Sophie's offhand comment. My mother's unremarkable coffee sighting. The locked box in the office. None of it, on its own, meant anything. All of it, together, was already the outline of something I didn't yet have the courage to name. I didn't know it then, but the locked box wasn't the only place in our house holding something I wasn't supposed to find, and the bracelet I would eventually discover in her coat pocket that Tuesday in the new year was going to be the smallest, most recent item in a collection that had been quietly growing for almost a full year. The weeks after I found the bracelet moved differently than the weeks before it. I carried it in my own coat pocket for 4 days before I did anything at all, taking it out at odd moments, sitting in my truck outside the grocery store, standing in the station's kitchen at 2 in the morning between calls, turning it over in my palm like I might discover something new about it the 20th time I read the same 4 words. I want to explain the specific shape of that week, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I wasn't paralyzed by shock exactly. I was doing something closer to reconnaissance, trying to determine, methodically, the actual scope of what I was dealing with before I let myself react to any single piece of it. 14 years of firefighting teaches you that instinct whether you want it or not. You don't rush into a structure without understanding what you're walking into, because rushing in blind gets people killed. I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice for months. The frequency of Winchester Project text notifications on Vanessa's phone, which I'd stopped paying attention to the way you stop hearing a familiar sound. The locked box in her office, which I found myself glancing at every time I walked past the doorway, wondering what else might be sitting inside it. The specific, careful way she'd started angling her phone screen away from me at the dinner table, a habit so gradual I couldn't have told you when exactly it had started. I didn't confront her about the bracelet that first week. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, the way I'd waited to open the folder with my finances laid out before a major purchase, methodical, unhurried. The truth, I think now, was closer to fear, the specific fear of a man who suspects that once he asks the question out loud, there's no version of his life afterward that goes back to looking like it did before. There was a night that week, close to Christmas, when I sat in the truck in our own driveway for almost 20 minutes after a shift, engine off, watching the warm light in our kitchen window where I could see Vanessa moving around, making dinner, calling something to the kids I couldn't hear through the glass. I remember thinking, with a kind of quiet devastation, that from the outside our house looked exactly like it always had, warm, ordinary, entirely intact, and that the version of the truth sitting in my coat pocket had no visible relationship at all to the picture in that window. Looking back now, I think that was the actual turning point, not finding the bracelet itself, but that 20 minutes in the driveway, when I understood for the first time that the house I was looking at and the marriage I actually had were no longer the same thing, even though nothing about the window had changed at all. I searched the office the following weekend, while Vanessa took the kids to her sister's for the afternoon. I want to be honest that this wasn't an accident the way finding the bracelet had been. I went looking on purpose, deliberately, with a key I'd found in a drawer months earlier for an entirely different reason and had never once thought to use until now. The locked box held exactly what I'd feared it might, and more than I'd let myself imagine. A card, unsigned except for a single initial, with a short handwritten note inside about a weekend that apparently hadn't been the work trip Vanessa had described to me at the time. A small watercolor painting, unframed, of the two of them I recognized only by silhouette against what looked like a river somewhere, painted by someone with real skill, someone who'd clearly spent real time observing her closely enough to render her posture accurately from memory. A pressed flower between two pieces of wax paper, the kind of thing you keep from a specific day you don't want to forget. A second, smaller box beneath all of it holding a pair of earrings I didn't recognize, tags removed, never worn, waiting, I understood with a sick lurch, for an occasion that hadn't happened yet, or had been planned for one that never would. I sat on the floor of my wife's office for a long time, surrounded by evidence of a relationship that had clearly been given more careful attention, more deliberate tenderness, than I'd realized our own marriage had been receiving in months. It wasn't only the volume of it that undid me. It was the specificity, the watercolor, the pressed flower, the small handwritten details that told me this wasn't a reckless, thoughtless affair. Someone had been courting my wife with real care, over real time, and she had kept every piece of it close enough to touch. I didn't cry that afternoon, sitting on that floor. I felt something colder than crying, a kind of methodical, expanding clarity, the same feeling I get walking into a structure and understanding, all at once, exactly how bad the damage actually is before anyone's even told me. I photographed everything before I put it all back exactly as I'd found it, box locked, key returned to its drawer, no trace that I'd ever been inside. I don't fully know why I chose to hide my own discovery rather than confront her that same afternoon, except that some part of me, the same part that assesses a fire scene before committing a crew to it, understood that I didn't yet have the full picture, and acting on an incomplete picture in a situation like this could cost more than I was prepared to lose. The subplot with my mother complicated things further than I initially understood. I called her that week, careful, oblique, asking whether she remembered any other details from the coffee shop sighting months earlier, what he looked like, how they'd seemed together. She described a man matching the general shape of a contractor, easy in his body, attentive in the specific way you're attentive to someone you're genuinely fond of rather than simply working alongside. They looked comfortable together, my mother said, not understanding yet what that observation was doing to me on the other end of the line. Like old friends. Why do you ask? I didn't tell her why. I thanked her and hung up and sat with the confirmation of something I'd already known for a week, feeling it settle deeper into the actual architecture of my body, my chest, my hands, the specific hollow feeling behind my sternum that hadn't fully left since the afternoon on the office floor. I want to pause the account here, because I didn't know it yet, but Vanessa's own side of that same season had its own weather system entirely, one I wouldn't understand the shape of until much later, when she finally told me herself. I remember the week Owen came home from that string of brutal shifts in the fall, exhausted in a way that scared me a little, and some part of me made a decision that week I never fully admitted to myself in real time, that I would keep going with Ethan a little longer, just until things settled, just until Owen wasn't so worn down, telling myself I was protecting him from having to deal with anything else while he was already so depleted. I understand now that was never really about protecting him. It was about not being ready to give up the one part of my week that made me feel like a whole person instead of just a schedule everyone else was relying on. That's what she told me, eventually. I knew none of it at the time, I only knew that the woman coming home lighter after certain days and heavier after others had a source for both states that I'd finally started to understand, piece by piece, on my own. By early January I had decided, quietly, without telling anyone, that I needed to know the entire scope of it before I said a single word. Part of this was the same instinct that's kept me alive on calls for 14 years. You don't act on partial information in a high-stakes situation, you gather what you can, you assess the whole structure before you commit to how you're going to move through it. Part of it, less noble, was simple dread, a fear that if I confronted her too early, with an incomplete picture, she would find a way to minimize what I'd found, to make the office box seem smaller and more innocent than it actually was, and I needed to have already seen the whole shape of it before she got the chance to reshape it in front of me. I started documenting everything methodically, photographs of the office box's contents, dates cross-referenced against the Winchester project, texts I'd started actually reading over her shoulder when I got the chance, a growing understanding of a timeline that stretched back nearly a full year, far longer than I'd initially let myself believe. There was a night in mid-January, the hardest one, I think, of that entire stretch, when Vanessa came home from a site visit glowing in exactly the way I now recognized for what it actually was, kissed me on the way past to check on the kids, and I stood in the kitchen afterward with my hands flat on the counter, breathing slowly, deliberately, the same breathing technique I use walking into a burning structure, and felt something in me settle into a kind of grim, prepared stillness. I didn't say anything that night. I lay awake beside her long after her breathing had slowed into sleep, running the timeline again in my head, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me a little, I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes before I let her know I know anything at all. I didn't understand yet how deep it actually went. I thought I was investigating a year-long affair, painful but at least contained to a single relationship. I had no idea, that week, that the bracelet itself, the very thing that had started all of this, hadn't come from where I assumed it had, or that Ethan wasn't entirely who he'd presented himself to be either. I didn't go looking for more on purpose, not at first. That's not entirely true, and I want to be honest here, in the way this whole account only works if I am, by late January, some part of me had already decided I was going to find everything there was to find. I just needed a reason that let me feel, a little longer, like I hadn't fully decided anything yet. The reason arrived on a Saturday, one of my days off, when Vanessa took the kids to a birthday party across town and I had the house entirely to myself for the first time in weeks. I want you to understand that what I did that afternoon wasn't impulsive. I'd been planning it for days, mapping the house mentally the way I'd map an unfamiliar structure before a call, where else might something be hidden, given what I already knew about how carefully she'd concealed the office box. I found the second cache in the attic, inside an old suitcase pushed against the far wall, behind boxes of Sophie's outgrown baby clothes that Vanessa had always been sentimental about keeping. It wasn't hidden particularly well, I think. Looking back, she genuinely believed no one would ever have reason to dig through a suitcase of baby clothes she was saving for a daughter who might someday want them. I only found it because I was being thorough, checking every space I could reach, the same instinct that saved lives on calls where the fire wasn't where anyone expected it to be. Inside was a stack of letters, actual handwritten letters, more than a dozen of them, spanning what the dates told me was nearly the entire length of the relationship, starting almost exactly a year before I'd found the bracelet, months earlier than even the office box had suggested. I sat down on the attic floor and read them, start to finish, without stopping to protect myself from any of it. I didn't think about what I was about to read. I only thought, I need to see the bottom of this before they get home from the party. I won't reproduce what was in them, some of it doesn't belong in the retelling, and some of it I've chosen not to carry forward into how I tell this story now, but I'll tell you what it did to me, sitting cross-legged on our attic floor in the cold January light coming through the single small window. It wasn't only evidence of an affair anymore. It was evidence of an entire courtship, conducted in parallel to our marriage, built out of the specific, patient attentiveness of someone who had clearly been paying closer attention to my wife than I had in longer than either of us had probably wanted to admit. There were references in the letters to conversations I'd never known about, inside jokes, a shared vocabulary that had built up over months the way real intimacy does. One letter, dated only 6 weeks earlier, described a weekend Vanessa had told me was a solo work retreat to clear her head before a big client presentation. The last letter in the stack, dated less than 2 weeks before I'd found the bracelet, was different in tone from the others, shorter, more urgent, and it mentioned, plainly, that Ethan was engaged to someone else. Had been engaged, in fact, for the better part of 8 months, to a woman named Kayla he'd apparently been building an entirely separate, public life with the entire time he was writing my wife letters and hiding a bracelet with her name inscribed inside the clasp. I sat very still in that attic for a long time. I want to be honest that some part of me had braced for the affair itself. I hadn't braced for the discovery that the man my wife had given a year of hidden devotion to had, apparently, been building the exact same kind of parallel life she had, that neither of them, in some strange, mirrored way, had ever fully belonged to what they were promising each other in those letters either. Even now, when I think back to that attic, something in my chest tightens the same way it did then, as though the memory hasn't entirely finished happening. I photographed everything, methodically, the way I'd document a scene for an incident report, every letter, every date, working to reconstruct a full and accurate timeline rather than a partial one. I put the suitcase back exactly as I'd found it, behind the same boxes, at the same angle, and I sat with my own hands in my lap for a long time before I climbed back down the attic stairs. The second major piece of the puzzle arrived a week later, almost by accident, the way so much of this had. Vanessa's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs with Noah, and a message preview flashed across the lock screen before disappearing again. Kayla found the letters in his truck. It's over on my end. I think you should know before you hear it somewhere else. I stood there holding a dish towel, staring at a screen already gone dark, and understood two things at once. First, Ethan's engagement had just collapsed, publicly, over the exact same category of evidence I'd already found privately in our own attic. Second, whoever had sent that message, a friend, I'd later learn, someone who'd known about the affair for months and had been quietly torn about whether to say anything, had just handed Vanessa a warning that her own house of cards was about to come down from an entirely different direction than the one she'd been watching. That was the moment something in me shifted from suspicion into full, settled certainty, not because of what the message revealed about Ethan's own unraveling, but because it revealed that Vanessa was about to receive proof of exactly how much of this had never been what she thought it was, and I understood I needed to know everything before that realization changed how she told the story to me. I didn't confront her that day. I want to explain why, because it matters for understanding who I am inside this story, and it isn't entirely flattering. I was afraid, not of her exactly, but of what came after her, of Sophie and Noah's faces at breakfast the next morning if everything cracked open that same night, of a house that would suddenly hold a completely different shape than the one they'd fallen asleep in the night before. So I did the thing firefighters are trained to do when a structure looks unstable. I assessed before I committed. I built a complete file, photographs, dates, the timeline reconstructed from both the office box and the attic suitcase, and I told myself I was preparing for an honest conversation, when really, looking back, I was giving myself just a little more time before that conversation became unavoidable. There's a thought that arrived slowly over the 2 weeks I spent finishing that file, and it stayed with me since, in a way that reaches beyond just this marriage. I used to believe that trust, once given fully, was supposed to be enough on its own, that a good marriage ran on trust the way an engine runs on fuel, and that questioning it too closely was itself a kind of failure. I don't believe that anymore. I think trust without attention is just hope wearing a more respectable name, and hope alone has never once put out a fire. I want to pause the account again here, because I didn't know it yet, but Vanessa's own side of that same week carried its own separate collapse, one I only understood the full shape of much later, in her own words. The week I found out about Kayla, something in me actually broke, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in the entire year before that. I'd spent 12 months telling myself Ethan and I were building something real, something that justified what I was risking, and finding out he'd been engaged the entire time, that I'd been as much a secret in his life as he was in mine, took away the one story I'd been telling myself that made any of it feel like less than what it actually was. I remember sitting in my car outside the coffee shop where I'd found out, unable to drive for almost half an hour, finally understanding that I hadn't been building a real second life at all. I'd been borrowed, the same way I'd been borrowing pieces of myself away from my own marriage without ever fully giving myself to either one. That's what she told me, eventually. I knew none of it at the time. I only knew that the shape of what I was about to confront had just changed again, in ways that would matter enormously for how the next conversation went. I built a final folder, complete now, and I chose a Saturday 2 weeks out, once the kids were settled at Vanessa's parents' for an overnight, to finally sit down with everything I'd found. If I had confronted her the same week I found the letters in the attic, everything that followed might have gone differently. I understand that now. I waited instead, and in those 2 weeks Vanessa, reeling from her own private collapse over Ethan, though I didn't know it at the time, grew quieter, more withdrawn, more unlike herself in ways I initially misread as guilt alone, when it was something more complicated than that, grief, layered directly on top of the guilt, for a version of a relationship that had never actually been what she'd believed it was. I didn't know it yet, but the conversation I was about to have wasn't going to unfold the way I'd rehearsed it in my head for 2 weeks at all, because the woman I was about to confront had already, in her own private way, been broken open by someone else's betrayal days before I ever said a single word. I sat Vanessa down at the kitchen table on a Saturday evening in early February, the house quiet with the kids gone for the night, a folder in front of me I'd rehearsed opening a dozen different ways in my head and still didn't fully know how to start. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to actually answer me honestly, because I already know most of it. I found the bracelet in your coat pocket in January. I found the box in your office. I found the letters in the attic." I watched her face change in stages, first a kind of frozen shock, and then, underneath it, something I hadn't expected at all, relief. Not happiness, nothing close to that, but the specific, visible relief of someone who has been carrying something enormous alone for a very long time and has just been told, finally, that they don't have to carry it by themselves anymore, even if what comes next is going to be terrible. She didn't deny any of it. She didn't ask how I'd found it, or try to minimize what the evidence meant. She sat very still for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the table, and when she finally spoke her voice was already breaking. "I know about Kayla," she said. "I found out 2 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, and I couldn't, because telling you meant admitting all of it at once, and I didn't know how to do that without losing everything in the same 5 minutes." Something in her seemed to give way entirely then, not gradually, but all at once, the way a wall gives way after holding weight it was never built to hold for this long. She put her face in her hands and her shoulders started to shake, and for a long moment she couldn't speak at all, just sat there across from me, crying in a way I hadn't seen from her since we'd lost her father 4 years earlier. I felt something crack open in myself too, watching her. I want to be honest that I hadn't expected this. I'd braced for denial, for deflection, for the smooth, rehearsed explanations I'd watched her deploy for months. I hadn't braced for a genuine collapse, and it undid something in my own carefully held composure that I'd been protecting for 2 full weeks. "I need you to talk to me," I said, and my own voice wasn't steady either. "I need you to actually tell me what happened. All of it. I can't keep piecing this together from things I find in the attic." She nodded, wiping her face, and when she finally spoke again, it came out slowly at first, then faster, like something that had been dammed up for a year finally finding an opening wide enough to move through. "It started with the Winchester project," she said. "I know that sounds like an excuse, and it isn't meant to be one. I just need you to understand the actual beginning, because I've spent a year telling myself a version of the story that made it feel smaller than it was, and I don't want to do that anymore, not with you, not tonight. Ethan and I started as exactly what I told you, a work relationship, a genuinely good one, the kind where you enjoy someone's company because they're sharp and funny and good at what they do. I want you to know I didn't go looking for anything beyond that. But somewhere in the middle of that spring, I noticed that I looked forward to our site meetings in a way I hadn't looked forward to much of anything in a long time, and instead of asking myself why, I told myself it was just because the project was exciting. That was the first lie, and it was so small I almost believed it wasn't a lie at all. I want to try to explain the why, not to excuse it, because nothing excuses what I did to you, to our kids, to this whole life we built, but because I think you deserve to understand it instead of just knowing the facts. Somewhere in the years after Noah was born, I stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a function, the one who remembers the pediatrician appointments, the one who keeps the calendar, the one everyone in this house relies on without ever really seeing. I know you were working brutal shifts. I know you were exhausted too. I'm not saying this to blame you for what I did. I'm saying it because Ethan was the first person in years who looked at me like I was still someone, not just something that ran the house. That feeling was like water in a desert, Owen, and I drank it without asking myself what it was going to cost, because I was so thirsty I couldn't think past the relief of it. The first time we crossed a real line, I told myself it was a mistake I'd correct, that I'd end it before it became anything more than a moment I'd feel guilty about privately and never repeat. That's what I told myself for weeks. Each time I told myself the same thing, and each time it became a little less true, until I wasn't even pretending to myself that I meant it anymore. He gave me the bracelet on our 6-month anniversary. I know that sounds insane to say out loud, an anniversary, like it was a real relationship instead of the thing it actually was, a betrayal with a calendar attached to it. I kept it in my coat because I couldn't bring myself to keep it anywhere in this house that felt permanent, and I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either, and I understand now how much that says about how unfinished my own feelings about all of it actually were. The shame is specific, and I want to actually say it instead of just telling you I felt ashamed, because that word doesn't cover what it actually felt like. There were mornings I couldn't look at Sophie's school photo on the mantle, the one where she's missing her front tooth, because something about her face looking straight at the camera made me feel like she already knew, even though she couldn't have. I started avoiding the living room some mornings. I told myself it was because I was in a hurry to get the kids out the door. It wasn't that. When I found out 2 weeks ago that he'd been engaged this entire time, that I'd never been anything close to what I thought I was to him, I think something in me finally understood what I'd actually done, not just to you, but to myself. I'd spent a year building a story where I was choosing something real, something that justified the risk, and it turned out I'd never had any of that at all. I'd just been someone he was borrowing time from, the same way I was borrowing myself away from you and the kids without ever fully giving myself anywhere at all. I don't know how to ask you to forgive this. I don't think I've earned the right to ask that yet, and maybe I never will. I just needed you to hear it from me, finally, instead of from an attic full of letters. The kitchen was very quiet after she finished. I sat there with the folder still closed on the table between us, and I felt something enormous and complicated moving through me, not relief exactly, not the clean anger I'd expected to feel either, something closer to grief for a version of our marriage I understood, fully now, had been quietly dying for at least a year without my noticing. I want to try, I said finally, and I meant it in that moment, even though some part of me already suspected, even as I said it, that wanting to try and actually being able to might turn out to be two very different things. I don't know if I can get past this. But I don't want to blow up everything tonight without at least trying first. We tried, for a while. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. This isn't a story where I confronted her and walked out the same night. We went to counseling. We had long, difficult conversations, some of them almost as raw as that first one at the kitchen table. There were weeks that spring where I genuinely believed we might find our way back to something workable, even if it could never again be what it was before. But the trying didn't hold, in the end, not because either of us stopped putting in the effort, but because I discovered, over the months that followed, that I couldn't be in a room with her without some part of my mind returning, uninvited, to the attic floor, to the specific handwriting in those letters, to the particular betrayal of a year's worth of careful, deliberate tenderness given to someone else while I was working shifts to keep our family running. I tried. I want that on the record clearly. The pain simply outlasted the trying, in the end, the way some structural damage looks reparable until you actually try to put weight back on it and understand, finally, that it can't hold what it used to hold anymore. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that kitchen the night of the confession, that the failed trying that followed would take almost 8 more months to fully play out, and that when it finally ended, it would end not with another explosion, but with something quieter and more final than either of us had expected. We separated in October, 8 months after that first conversation at the kitchen table. I want to be clear that it wasn't a single dramatic rupture that ended it, there wasn't a second discovery, no new betrayal to point to. It was simply the slow, accumulating weight of trying and not fully healing, month after month, until we both understood, separately and then together, that we were keeping a structure standing that had already failed the load test months earlier. The divorce, when it came, wasn't the kind either of us had imagined for ourselves 12 years earlier. Vanessa's business had taken a real hit that year. Several of her longtime clients, who'd known us both socially, quietly stopped calling once word moved through the specific, small world circles of Richmond's design community. I didn't orchestrate any of that. I didn't need to. The consequences she faced weren't ones I built for her, they were simply the natural, unengineered result of a year spent building something that couldn't survive daylight. Ethan never resurfaced in any meaningful way. His engagement to Kayla ended publicly and badly, and from what little Vanessa heard through mutual industry contacts afterward, he left Richmond entirely within the year, taking a contracting job somewhere in North Carolina. He simply wasn't in the picture anymore. No dramatic reckoning, no visible consequence I ever witnessed directly, just an absence where a person used to be. I ended up with primary custody of Sophie and Noah, and the house, in the settlement, not because I fought viciously for either, but because Vanessa, in the months of mediation, seemed to understand something had shifted in her own capacity to hold the center of our old life together, and she didn't contest much of what I asked for. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it was the plainest, most concrete measure of where we each landed by the end of it. I kept the structure standing. She started over from somewhere closer to zero. Sophie and Noah were 9 and 5 when we told them, together, in the plainest terms we could manage, that Mom and Dad were going to live in different houses. Sophie cried for a few days and asked hard questions I didn't always have good answers for. Noah, at 5, mostly wanted to know whether he'd still have his same room, and once I told him yes, he seemed satisfied enough to move on to the next thing, the way 5-year-olds do. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is worth saying plainly, without dressing it up the way people sometimes do at the end of stories like this. I spent a long time turning over my own part in the years before any of this happened, not to excuse what Vanessa did, because nothing excuses it, but because I don't think it's honest to tell this story as though I arrived at that kitchen table a perfect, blameless witness to someone else's failure. I trusted almost automatically, for 12 years, in a way that meant I rarely asked the hard questions even when small things didn't add up. That trust wasn't the cause of what she did. But I understood, sitting with it honestly over the months that followed, that I had built exactly the kind of marriage where a slow, year-long drift like hers could accumulate almost entirely unchallenged, because I had never once made it feel necessary, or even normal, for either of us to say out loud that something underneath the schedule and the logistics had gone quiet. I moved through the months after the divorce in stages I didn't fully recognize until I was already past them. Anger first, sharper than I expected, the kind that made ordinary tasks, grocery shopping with 2 kids in tow, the drive past her old office downtown, feel like they required more effort than they should have. Then something flatter, weeks where I mostly just functioned, worked my shifts, got the kids to school, didn't examine much of anything too closely because I didn't have the capacity left to. And then, slowly, without my noticing the exact day it started, something steadier began to settle in underneath all of it. I started sleeping through the night again sometime in early spring the following year. I remember waking up on an ordinary Wednesday and realizing I'd slept 8 full hours without once surfacing into the particular watchfulness I'd been carrying, without fully knowing I was carrying it, for most of the year before. The tension I'd been holding in my shoulders for over a year, the kind I'd stopped noticing because it had simply become the shape of my body, was gone one morning, the way weight sometimes leaves you without announcing itself, just an absence you notice only once it's already happened. I wasn't the same man who'd stood in our bedroom in January with a stranger's bracelet in his palm, telling himself there was an innocent explanation. I was quieter now, in a different way than before, steadier with the kids, more willing to say the uncomfortable thing out loud before it had a year to calcify into something worse, more myself, I think, than I'd been in longer than I'd realized. Sophie asked me once, months later, unprompted, why some marriages end and some don't. I didn't have a clean answer for a 9-year-old. I told her that sometimes people stop being honest with each other about small things, long before anyone notices, and that by the time the small things add up to something big, it's often too late to fix. She thought about that for a moment, the way kids do, and then asked if she could have a snack, and the conversation moved on the way conversations with 9-year-olds do, but I've thought about that answer more than once since, wondering if it was the truest thing I've said about any of it.